So with this last section here, we're going to kind of look at now what happens. So these places are independent. They've thrown off the yoke of their European oppressors. Now what? So a lot of new nations emerging from colonial rule are confronted by the problem of how to parlay independence into economic development, industrial growth, unification, and also political participation. Another way to look at this is now they're independent. Now they have to operate just like all of the other modern nations operate. And the problem is that they're going to have absolutely no idea how to do it. So you're going to see a lot of different places trying a lot of different things, sometimes trying those a lot of different things in a very, very short period of time. And a lot are going to struggle. There will be a couple, I don't want to necessarily say winners, but a couple success stories or sort of kind of success stories, or at least relatively better off success stories. And the ironic thing here is that already independent but non-industrialized countries are going to face the same quest for a better life. So places like in South America rather, that have been independent for more than a century, by the time we get to the middle of the 1900s, the middle of the 20th century, these guys are struggling with a lot of the same issues that these newly independent nations are also going to be struggling with. Between 1950 and 2000, the developing nations are going to contain 70% of the world's population. You want to put down here next to number three that they accounted for almost all of the quadrupling. They accounted for almost all of the quadrupling of world population in the 20th century. So, in other words, not only do these countries have to figure out how to be a country and how to all of a sudden, jump into the second half of the 20th century with both feet and kind of have a lot of the characteristics of these nations that have their crap far more together, but they also now have to deal with this unbelievable population boom that is going on largely within their borders. So we have a couple things that are going to be going on here in this particular section. One, we have some common conditions that are going to confront all efforts to establish political order in these new colonies. One, we have explosive population growth. Got to deal with that. We also have overly high expectations for independence. I mean, a lot of people believe as soon as they get rid of the Europeans, their lives are going to be instantaneously better. And when they're not, there's going to be some problems. There's going to be some turmoil. And these governments, these newly independent governments, are going to have to try to figure out how do we manage people's expectations. And then on top of it, there's going to be a lot of cultural diversity with very little loyalty to a central state. Because remember, a lot of these places, especially if we're talking about Africa, these countries didn't exist until the Europeans drew their borders. And there is nothing was taken into consideration, or none of the Africans' desires or practicalities were taken into consideration by the Europeans. These countries, the borders that the Europeans create, are completely and totally for the sole benefit of the Europeans. Well, now you have this nation that never really existed organically within these places. Now you have to create some type of a loyalty to that nation, some type of rallying cry to get all of these diverse people that may or may not get along together to kind of come together in some type of nationalist organization. And because this is going to be such a key thing, and it's going to be one of the common things that everybody's going to have to deal with, you want to go ahead and put a star here, big star by A, B, and C underneath number one. All of these places, we have a variety of different types of governments being used, including communist governments, one party state, democracies. I mean, in a lot of cases, we are just trying anything and everything to see what is going to work. In the 1950s, some European authorities are going to set up some democratic institutions in their African colonies, but ultimately they're just going to walk out on them. So now you have these Africans who are trying to rule a country that never existed before the Europeans and trying to use ideas that the Europeans brought to them without ever explaining exactly how to use them. And then the Europeans leave. In India, Western style democracy did succeed. However, here's the thing, and this is going to be the key point. In fact, you want to go ahead before we talk about it. You want to put a star by A, because this is going to be one of the main reasons why democracy is going to function far better in India than it will in any of these other former colonies. The thing here is that the independence movement was more extended and power was handed over gradually. What you have in a lot of these African colonies or these former African colonies, again, like I told you at the beginning of the chapter, Europeans bail on them. Like they smack them on the butt and say, hey, good game, and they're gone. And now you have these Africans and a lot of other people within these former imperial holdings just sort of kind of standing there going, well, now what do we do? I mean, we have no idea what we should do. We have no idea what the next step is. We got rid of the Europeans, you know, now what? Additionally, here with India, the Indian National Congress Party, the INC, embodied the whole nationalist movement without too much internal discord. The INC, as an independence movement, as an early, and I'm kind of using the term loosely, nationalist movement, is going to have its stuff together a lot more and for a lot longer than a lot of these other nationalist movements or these independence groups within some of these other places. Elsewhere, democracy is going to be much more fragile. Very few are going to still survive by the early 1970s, and many of them are going to be swept away by military coups. In fact, you want to go ahead and put a star there by B. Now, there's going to be a lot of ideas or a couple different arguments why Africans initially rejected democracy. And this is going to kind of be a big thing. So you want to go ahead and just put a star here by A, B, and C underneath number 6. Some are going to argue that Africans were not ready for democracy or lack some necessary element. I mean, the concept of democracy, at least in a modern sense, is a very European type of idea. You also, since day one of empire, even colonies, if you want to go back a little further, the Africans specifically, and really anybody the Europeans are coming into contact with generally, are being excluded from the inner workings of government. So, in particular, these Africans have absolutely no idea what's going on. They've been pushed off to the side and not allowed really any type of participation in their own nation. Some are also going to argue that African traditional culture, which is communal and based on consensus, was not compatible with party politics. Like if the Africans go back to the argument is that if the Africans go back to what they had known before the Europeans, it tends to be more of a team effort rather than a team's effort. Like everyone is looking at it for the common good, not necessarily, one group has these interests, another group has these interests, another group has these interests, and yet another group has these interests. Some are also going to argue that Western style democracy was inadequate to the task of development. If you think about, especially Europe as an example, the vast majority of the development that allowed Europe to become dominant was done largely under monarchies. It wasn't done under any type of democratic system. I mean, the exception is sort of kind of France, and we can argue about how successful France was as an imperial power, or as a large scale imperial power, or a dominant European or global force. But at the end of the day, all these powerhouses, whether it's England, whether it's Germany, for example, a lot of that development was done under non-democratic forms of government. So there's the argument that, this type of modern 20th century democracy just isn't equipped to get the job done. Another issue is that widespread economic disappointment is going to discredit early African democracies. And in fact, you want to put down here next to number 7, do you want to put down this is one of the reasons, for military strongmen. I mean, like I've said before, whenever you have economic problems, you have political problems. Whenever you have political problems, you have economic problems. It's, this double-headed, dragon of doom. So in a lot of cases, these newly independent African nations will begin as democracies, but the democracies are inadequate to deal with the economic problems. And also the heightened belief that, oh, wait a second, we're independent, our lives are going to be instantaneously better. They're not able to manage those expectations. So people very quickly are going to start to lose faith in these democratic governments. And once you have somebody with no neck, big biceps, and, heavily armed guards saying, hey, I have the solution to this, no one's really going to stand in their way when they come in and they overthrow that democratic government. You're going to see this in a lot of places, not just simply within Africa. Also, again, when you have economic problems, you're also going to have some social problems. So, a lot of this economic resentment is also going to find expression in ethnic conflict. Remember, these African nations were arbitrarily created. Not only African nations, but also some Southeast Asian nations as well. So, these borders are including people and that don't necessarily get along with others, or there's a long legacy, there's a long history of ethnic conflict or tribal conflict amongst one group versus another group. The diversity within some of these places really starts to become a problem once the Europeans leave. Because the Europeans, don't want to deal with anybody's crap, and they're going to smash everyone down because they see them as kind of a uniform group of people, where in reality they're amazingly diverse. So as soon as that kind of European overlordship, that overwhelming control is gone, now all of these like little ethnic groups, the situations that the Europeans have been able to put a lid on for the better part of a century or more is going to start to bubble over here as well. And in fact, you want to put down here next to number 9. And again, this is just to kind of reinforce a small part of what I just said. You want to put, please, that all of these countries are ethnically and racially diverse. All of these countries are ethnically and racially diverse. Because of this turmoil, repeatedly the military is going to take power in a crisis. Again, not just simply in Africa, we also see this within Latin America. Military forces had a long history of intervention in Latin America. We also have demographic, economic, and social challenge, the privileges of the rich and powerful. You want to put down here next to number 2 that these were not solved by the independence movements. These were not solved by the independence movements of the 19th century. I mean, in Latin America, even though they were like the great great grandfathers of these independence movements, and they largely get independence in, the late 1840s, 1850s, those independence movements sometimes don't solve an even more basic problem than the Spanish colonialism. It doesn't necessarily correct any of the economic problems, the social problems, or even some of the racial problems. And that for the past century plus at this point is, kind of bubbling over, and bubbling over. The most extensive expression in the developing countries of Latin Latin America, Africa, and also Asia. Most recently, this is going to be in Arab countries. And the big thing here is you want to put a little star here underneath 18, that kind of unlabeled sentence, that what accounts for this reemergence of Western style democracy? Well, a couple things. And actually, it's going to be two things. So you want to go ahead and put a big star here by 19 and 20. One is the untethering of the ideas of democracy and human rights from their Western origins. A lot of these independent nations, these newly independent nations, they don't want anything to do with anything coming from the West. Like they just immediately recoil against it because of its legacy as a Western idea. As time goes on, there becomes a separation between or from human rights and democracy from being a Western idea. They just see it as something as universal, not something that's singularly Western. There's also a failure of the authoritarian regimes to raise the standard of living, provide jobs, and also combat corruption. I mean, a lot of the things that these, for example, these military strongmen say that they are there to alleviate or to get rid of in these first generation democratic governments in these newly freed and independent nations, they kind of fall back into. So the people end up not really any happier with them in the long run and kind of gravitate back towards some type of democratic principle because, maybe that'll give them a better chance at some of these natural rights that they want, raising standards of living, better jobs, no corruption, that type of thing. What we also here are seeing universally are these grassroots movements providing a social foundation to demand change. The other uniform thing is that there's variable results from this process. Again, you will see that some will be really, really great, some will be sort of kind of rock stars, and others, ooh, nowhere near rock stars. So we've had with what we just dealt with for the last page, we kind of dealt with the experiment in politics. Now, with this one, we're going to start to experiment with economic development here as well. The big thing here, and you want to go ahead and put a star by number one underneath capital B. The big idea is that the belief that poverty is an inevitable one out, that a nation doesn't have to be poor, that a nation can improve its economic position, that it can improve its economic standing, that there's optimism for a country's economics. That's starting to become more and more of a thing rather than, oh hell, we're just sort of kind of screwed. However, in many states, colonial rule really hadn't provided much infrastructure for modern development. Again, if you remember back a couple chapters, the Europeans only did things that would benefit the Europeans. So if it's not going to benefit the Europeans to build railroads, then that colony isn't going to get railroads. The other problem here is that once the Europeans leave, the European money also leaves. So the infrastructure that was built with European money. And while those places were colonies, were maintained with European money. But now with the Europeans gone, that money simply doesn't exist anymore. And that's going to be a big problem here coming up. And in fact, we'll even have a note about that here coming up in a minute or two. On top of this, leaders are also going to get contradictory advice about how to develop successfully. I mean, one of the things that kind of happens is this is where some aspects of the Cold War that's going on between the United States and the Soviet Union is going to get kind of lukewarm. You're going to have some communist advisors coming in and saying, hey, this is the way that things need to get done. You'll also have Western advisors coming in saying, no, 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 this is the way things need to get done. And some of these countries will really bounce back and forth between those two ideologies. The other problem that you have is that there's a general expectation in the developing world that the state would spur economic development. Previously, when they were a colony, it was the government that footed all the bills. Now, granted, the government during the imperial time were European backed or were, European driven. So again, like I said before, you know, European money is supporting a lot of this. And once the Europeans leave, so do their money. In fact, you want to put this note down here next to number 2, give or take a little bit. Do you want to put, please, that much of the money to do these projects came from the imperial countries. And when they left, so did the money. And when they left, so did the money. So you have all these people looking to the state for cash to kind of get the economy going. Well, the state doesn't have any cash because the Europeans didn't leave them any, and the Europeans certainly aren't going to continue to support them. So not only is this going to cause infrastructure problems, but it's also going to cause other economic problems because most private economies are going to be very weakly developed. Again, not only are the indigenous population pushed out of the political running of the government, but they're also pushed out of the economic life and the economic running of the government. So again, when the Europeans leave, not only are these guys trying to figure out how to rule, they're also trying to figure out how to make money as well. There ends up being a debate over shielding the economy or engaging in worldwide market while industrializing. We also have the issue of urban versus rural development being an important issue here as well. There's also the debate over whether foreign aid, investment, and trade are good or bad. You want to put down here next to number 5, you want to put down here the question is, does this help or continue their dependence? The question is, does this help or continue their dependence? A lot of people kind of look at the aid as a way to jumpstart the economy, that you have a foreign government who's investing and now they're putting money into the system and that money will cause more money to grow. And there are others who are saying, no, this is just sort of kind of another form of imperialism. It's a form of imperialism that doesn't require political control. Instead, it requires distant economic control because, there's strings attached to that foreign aid, to that financial aid that's being given to these countries. That not only do they have to pay it back with interest, but oftentimes they have to allow a certain degree of exploitative trade in a lot of ways to return to that now, newly independent nation. And of course, as with anything, the degree of the economic development is going to vary widely by region, just like, politics are going to vary widely, and success of those politics are going to vary widely by region. But before we get into it, you want to go ahead and put a star here by number 6. Because again, we do have some regions that are unbelievably successful. Like East Asia is going to be the most successful. In fact, in the late 90s, early 2000s, this region was the land of what the economist would call, the Asian tigers, because they, really came and they were very aggressive and very dominant economically. In the 90s, India is going to open itself more fully to the world market. Brazil, a former colony, is now the 8th largest economy in the world. Turkey and Indonesia are now in the top 20. So again, these places that had been so abused and dominated with imperialism are kind of making, their own like little economic comeback here. However, in most of Africa, much of the Arab world, and parts of Asia, they're not catching up, and standards of living often decline. Because again, the Europeans are just bailing on them. They're not giving them, or they're not showing them how to do anything. And they've never been shown how to do anything. So now they're kind of having to exist. They're having to exist on their own. And a lot of places just simply aren't doing it. And then on top of that, you also have, in a number of ways, their former imperial masters and others uh, taking advantage of their situation and kind of doing, brand new exploitative things. But there is really here no general agreement about why such great variations developed. There's kind of no rhyme or reason why some places take off and other places simply do not. The last experimentation that these former colonies are going to need to deal with is going to be a cultural experimentation. And this, we're going to have two case studies. And this is going to be with Turkey and Iran, and it's going to be the role of Islam. The relationship between Western style modernity and tradition has been an issue across the developing world. There's a big, and we'll kind of deal with this next chapter, there's a big issue over identity. Do we continue down the path of the identity that the Europeans give us? Do we go back to how we were prior to when the Europeans showed up? Or do we create this new variation? Where we take a little bit of the old, a little bit of the European, and we just sort of kind of create something from the new, from the now, and create a new modern identity. With the case of Islam, Turkey and Iran are going to approach the issue of how Islam and modernity should relate to each other very differently. In fact, you want to put a little star here by number two, because you will see that these guys are, night and day type of difference. With Turkey, and this is kind of where we left off with them a couple chapters ago. Remember, they get into World War One as the Ottoman Empire. At the end of World War One, Ottoman Empire no longer exists, and boom, we have the Turkish Republic. So Turkey is going to emerge in the wake of World War One, left by Mustafa Ataturk, which, by the way, is a fantastic last name. And with this, we have a major cultural revolution in the 20s and 30s, where they make an effort to create a thoroughly modern and Western society. You want to put down here next to B, underneath number three, that you want to put down that there was a desire to catch up. There was a desire to catch up. Now, we've had these reform movements before, but if you remember when they were the Ottoman Empire, and spoiler alert, these early years of the Republic, it's sort of kind of like the same people, just a different name. Um, there was this desire to try to westernize, but they were a little bit pickier with it. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, they tend to be less picky, and they're desperately trying to regain what they have lost, and to especially become as modern as they possibly could. Now, with this, much of the Islamic underpinning of society was abolished or put under firm government control. What this means, you're going to put this down here next to C. And again, another little small note, it won't take up much space. But you want to put down here Islam was below the state. Islam was below the state. So we have created, Turkey is a secular republic. This is going to clash 100% with what ultimately happens with Iran. Like, for example, men were ordered not to wear the fez, and many elite women gave up the veil. So again, we're kind of removing, while Islam is still important, it's not going to be the element within Turkey. However, with Iran, something completely and totally different here. Iran ultimately is going to become the center of the Islamic revival in the 1970s. But I do want you to get down here next to 4, because this isn't going to be completely and totally unique to Iran. What you want to put down here next to number 4 is throughout the Middle East, there is an Islamic revival in the 1970s that is anti-Western. There's a lot of things that the Western world is doing that is really ticking off the Islamic population within the Middle East. One of them is the creation and the support of the creation of Israel. So there's a lot of things going on. And then there's some economic problems, there's some political problems, there's, some diplomatic issues. I mean, it's more than just simply one country's decision or one region's decision. They're actually reacting against some of the Western policies and they're recoiling against everything and anything that is Western. And what they want to try to do here basically is to go back to something and entrench themselves in something that is uniquely them. And for them, it's going to be Islam. Well, specifically with Iran, there is a growing opposition to the Shah's modernizing and secularizing US supported government. Again, in Iran, a lot of people are just thinking that the United States is kind of getting their fingers in a little bit too much, that they're influencing, that they're manipulating a little bit too much. Um, Many of the Shah's reforms are going to offend traditional Islamic practices because the Shah at this point is very, very secular and very Western influenced. Ultimately, here, and by the way, we have a couple small notes or smallish notes that are kind of like back to back to back. So you might want to go one side, other side coming up here. I mean, I think there's two. There's one for C and then there's one for D here. Ultimately, the mosque is going to become the main center of opposition to the government. You want to put down here next to C, and I don't care which side you put it. Do you want to put, please, here that Shia, Shia leaders became the voice of opposition. Shia, Shia leaders became the voice of opposition. And if you remember, like way back when we talked about the different groups within Islam, remember the Shia Muslims are the more conservative of the Muslims. Ultimately, here, because of this opposition, the Shah was forced to abdicate in 1979, and Khomeini assumed control of the state. Do you want to put down here next to D? Again, I would go whatever other side you went from C. Do you want to put, please, here that there was the rejection there was the rejection of many Western practices as anti-Islamic. Ultimately, what you're going to see here from 1979 on is a cultural revolution that was based on the Islamization of public life. Where in Turkey, Turkey becomes less religious and more secular. Iran is becoming less secular and more religious. And this is also shown in the legal codes, where the Sharia law is going to replace secular law codes. Iran is also going to seek to export its revolution as well, and you're going to see a lot of Western sentiment radiating out of Iran and a lot of this Islamic renewal, this anti Western Islamic renewal, especially coming out of Iran. What I'd like you to do here at the bottom of the page, you can just go ahead and you can put it underneath K here, just put a star by this, and you want to put, please, here, the Islamic revolution in Iran wasn't revolutionary in social terms. The Islamic revolution in Iran wasn't revolutionary in social terms. Like, for example, they're not going to be so conservative that they stop the education of women. In fact, the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, and some of those more conservative Islamic nations in the 1970s, 1980s are actually going to have the highest per capita women with advanced degrees. And we're talking degrees like master's degrees, PhDs, and in everything and anything, from the liberal arts to a lot of sciences, um, mathematics, those types of things. So there are definitely some radical elements to it, but then there's also some, kind of still keeping, to a certain extent, the status quo, at least for now. One of the issues sometimes, and I know that I struggle with it, with looking at relatively recent things, um, is that it's difficult for historians to discuss more recent events and themes like decolonization, also some stuff that we're going to talk about next period, next chapter rather, because history is still in the making. This is still evolving. The fallout of imperialism, the economic, political, and cultural consequences of decolonization are still this ever evolving thing. So, because of this, detachment is very difficult. In other words, you want to put down here next to number one that it's too close and it's too fresh. It's too close and it's too fresh. For some historians, a lot of this isn't history, it's, modern memory. And it's very difficult to take a step back and look at it with a truly critical eye. And then you couple that with the fact that, this isn't the end of the story. The story is still evolving. It's very difficult for historians to kind of to address some of these more modern some of this more modern history in any type of a holistic or analytical way.